trauma-informed practices is this approach that, I think everyone who does trauma-informed practices means well, but we know that meaning well doesn't always mean doing well. The way that trauma-informed practices has become a buzzword and in a lot of schools just turned into this thing of, oh, we have a cool down corner or we teach breathing strategies, those types of things, which are important. I don't want to dismiss that, helping students regulate and all that stuff is really important. But, I've been observing over the past few years that that focus is sort of eclipsing everything else about trauma. And when I was looking into, where did trauma informed education come from? And moreover, where does the concept of trauma come from? The history is really interesting. And in both cases, the concept of trauma that we know today was really developed through the advocacy of survivors of violence. So the two main groups that were really advocating for people to see that their psychological pain was real were veterans of war and women survivors of domestic and sexual violence. And so these survivors really advocated and said, hear what we're saying, and feeling impacted by violence is real. It's not just something you can kind of get over or that makes you weak. And similarly, trauma-informed practice really came about through, initially in sort of the behavioral health, therapy, counseling world, really trying to create environments that were more responsive and respectful of those survivors. And so, then over the past 10 or 20 years, trauma-informed education becomes really a thing that gets, no, I say in the book that no one owns the concept of trauma-informed education, which is great because it means that you don't have to say trauma-informed education, TM, and it's not, you don't have to buy trauma-informed education from someone. But the problem is we're not always talking about the same thing. And so some people say that they're doing trauma-informed education by being more sensitive to the possible impact of trauma on student behavior. And that's an aspect, but to me, I really want to recenter trauma-informed education in the big picture of what is trauma, and recognizing that trauma is a political concept, it's a social concept, it's not neutral. Things like systems of oppression cause trauma. And so if we as educators are trying to respond to that, it's not as simple as, oh, I made a calm down corner in my classroom. It's also attending to all those social political elements and how those play out in a school. In the popular understanding of trauma, I think people's minds will go to something really big and intense, like being assaulted or surviving a violent natural disaster, and those things certainly can cause trauma. But in the research-based, trauma is also something that happens through living through a persistently dangerous environment, or the cumulative effects of low-level stress every single day. There's all kinds of things that can cause trauma. And in the trauma-informed education movement, often there's this big focus on the neuroscience of trauma and how trauma changes the brain. And I think that it works to reinforce the idea that trauma is like a big lightning bolt moment that upends your whole life. But the reality is that a lot of kids and a lot of adults are simply living in a great deal of stress, and the cumulative effects of that are trauma. And so to me, trauma-informed education is a few things, and this is why I center it in equity, because it's not just about being responsive to those that we perceive have experienced trauma, but really redesigning the whole education system to recognize how trauma is happening inside our schools, not just outside or in the kids' homes, as some people like to assume. So trauma is happening inside of school, and also because of that, we can disrupt it. If there are conditions inside our schools that are traumatic, then that's our job to disrupt. So the way that I define trauma-informed education is that we're being responsive to the impacts of trauma that students have already experienced, but then we're also disrupting and preventing trauma that may happen in our school and in a larger way in our society. And those things to me are really grounded in equity work, and the work we're doing for equity in our schools is really the same work that we need to do to disrupt those things that cause trauma.